Chapter 12. "You can't be in here," the man shouted. "Out! Get out of my home!" They were standing in a wide-open living area. There was a white baby grand piano in the far corner, near floor-to-ceiling windows with more spectacular views. Morning light streamed in. Nearby was a modern white sofa and table set with accent chairs, clustered around a giant flat-panel TV mounted on the wall. On the opposite wall was a massive canvas 10 feet high, with crazy splotches and drips of bright color. Luke knew something about art. He guessed it was a Jackson Pollock. "Yeah, we've been all through that with the guys out in the hall," Luke said. "We can't be here, and yet here we are." The man was not tall. He was thick and stubby and wearing a white plush robe. He was holding a large rifle and sighting down the barrel at them. It looked to Luke like an old Browning safari gun, probably loading .270 Winchester rounds. That thing would take down a moose at 400 yards. Luke moved to the right side of the room, Ed to the left. The man swung the rifle back and forth, unsure who to target. "Ali Nasser?" "Who is asking?" "I'm Luke Stone. That's Ed Newsom. We're federal agents." Luke and Ed circled the man, moving in closer. "I am a diplomat attached to the United Nations. You have no jurisdiction here." "We just want to ask you a couple of questions." "I've called the police. They will arrive in a few moments." "In that case, why don't you put the gun down?" "Listen, it's an old gun. You've got a bolt action on that thing. If you fire it once, you'll never have time to chamber the next round." "Then I will kill you and let the other one live." He spun toward Luke. Luke kept moving along the wall. He put his hands up to show he was no threat. He'd had so many guns pointed at him in his life that he had long ago lost track of them all. Still, he didn't feel good about this one. Ali Nasser didn't look like much of a marksman, but if he did manage to get a shot off, it was going to put a big hole in something. "If I were you, I'd kill that big man over there, because if you kill me, there's no telling what that guy's going to do. He likes me." Nasser didn't waver. "No, I will kill you." Ed was already behind the man and within 10 feet. He crossed the distance in a split second. He knocked the barrel of the gun upward, just as Nasser pulled the trigger. Boom! The report was loud in the confines of the apartment. The shot tore a hole through the white plaster of the ceiling. In one move, Ed snatched the gun away, punched Nasser in the jaw, and guided him to a seat in one of the accent chairs. "Okay, sit down. Careful, please." Nasser was jolted by the punch. It took several seconds for his eyes to come back to center. He held a chubby hand to the red welt that was already rising on his jaw. Ed showed Luke the rifle. "How about this thing?" It was ornate, with a pearl-inlaid stock and polished barrel. It had probably been hanging on a wall somewhere a few minutes before. Luke turned his attention to the man in the chair. He started from the beginning again. "Ali Nasser?" The man was pouting. He looked angry in the same way that Luke's son Gunnar used to look when he was 4 years old. He nodded. Obviously. Luke and Ed moved quickly, wasting no time. "You can't do this to me," Nasser said. Luke glanced at his watch. It was 7 a.m. The cops could show up any minute. They had him in an office just off the main living room. They had taken away Nasser's robe. They had taken away his slippers. He wore tighty-whitey underwear and nothing else. His large stomach protruded. It was tight, like a snare drum. They had him sitting in an armchair, his wrists zip-tied to the arms of the chair, his ankles zip-tied to the legs. The office had a desk with an old-style tower computer and desktop monitor. The CPU was inside a thick steel box, which itself was anchored to the stone floor. There was no obvious way to open the box, no lock, no door, nothing. To get at the hard drive, a welder would have to cut the box. There wasn't going to be any time for that. Luke and Ed stood over Nasser. You have a numbered account at Royal Heritage Bank on Grand Cayman Island, Luke said. On March 3rd, you made a $250,000 transfer to an account held by a man named Ken Bryant. Ken Bryant was strangled to death sometime last night in an apartment in Harlem. I have no idea what you're talking about. You are the employer of a man named Ibrahim Abdul Rahman, who died this morning in a sub-basement of Center Medical Center. He was killed with a gunshot to the head while he was stealing radioactive material. A flicker of recognition passed across Nasser's face. I do not know this man. Luke took a deep breath. Normally, he would have hours to interview a subject like this. Today, he had minutes. That meant he might have to cheat a little. Why is your computer bolted to the floor? Nasser shrugged. He was beginning to regain his confidence. Luke could almost see it come flooding back. The man believed in himself. He thought he was going to stonewall them. There is a great deal of confidential material in there. I have clients who are engaged in business deals involving intellectual property. I am also, as I indicated, a diplomat assigned to the United Nations. I receive communications from time to time that are, how would you call it, classified. I am in these positions because I am known for my discretion. That may be, Luke said. But I'm going to need you to give me the password so I can take a look for myself. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Behind Nasser, Ed laughed. It sounded like a grunt. You might be surprised at what's possible, Luke said. The fact is, we're going to access that computer, and you're going to give us the password. Now, there's an easy way to do this, and a hard way. The choice is up to you. You won't hurt me, Nasser said. You're already in a great deal of trouble. Luke glanced at Ed. Ed moved over and kneeled by Nasser's right side. He took Nasser's right hand in his two powerful hands. Luke and Ed had met for the first time late last night, but they were already starting to work together without verbal communication. It was like they were reading each other's minds. Luke had experienced this before, usually with guys who had been in special operations units, like Delta. The relationship usually took longer to develop. You play that piano in there? Luke said. Nasser nodded. I'm classically trained. When I was young, I was a concert pianist. I still play a bit for fun. Luke crouched down so he was at eye level with Nasser. In a moment, Ed is going to start breaking your fingers. That'll make it hard to play the piano, and it's going to hurt. Probably quite a bit. I'm not sure it's the kind of pain a man like you is accustomed to. You won't do it. The first time, I'm going to count to 3. That will give you a last few seconds to decide what you want to do. Unlike you, we warn people before we hurt them. We don't steal radioactive material and aim to kill millions of innocent people. Hell, you'll be getting off easy compared to what you're doing to the others. But after the first time, there won't be any more warnings. I'll just look at Ed, and he'll break another finger. Do you understand? I will have your job, Nasser said. 1. You are a little man with no power. You will regret ever coming here. 2. Don't you dare. 3. Ed broke Nasser's pinky at the second knuckle. He did it quickly, with very little effort. Luke heard the crunch just before Nasser screamed. The pinky bent out sideways. There was something almost obscene about the angle. Luke put his hand under Nasser's chin and tilted his head up. Nasser's teeth were gritted. His face was flushed, and his breath came in gasps. But his eyes were hard. That was just the pinky, Luke said. The next one is the thumb. Thumbs hurt a lot more than pinkies. Thumbs are more important, too. You are animals. I will tell you nothing. Luke glanced at Ed. Ed's face was hard. He shrugged and broke the thumb. This time it made a loud cracking sound. Luke stood up and let the man shriek for a moment. The sound was ear-splitting. He could hear it echoing through the apartment, like something from a horror movie. Maybe they should find a hand towel in the kitchen to use as a gag. He paced the room. He didn't enjoy this sort of thing. It was torture. He understood that. But the man's fingers would heal. If a dirty bomb went off on a subway train, many people would die. The survivors would get sick. No one would ever heal. Weighing the two, the man's fingers and dead people on a train, the decision was easy. Nasser was crying now. Clear mucus ran from one of his nostrils. He was breathing crazily. It sounded like, huh, 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 huh. "Look at me," Luke said. The man did as he was told. His eyes were no longer hard. "I see the thumb got your attention, so we'll take the left thumb next. After that, we'll start on the teeth. Ed?" Ed moved around to the man's left. "Khalil Gibran." Nasser gasped. "What's that?" "I didn't hear you." "Khalil_Gibran. It's the password." "Like the author," Luke said. "Yes. And what is it to work with love?" Ed said, quoting Gibran. Luke smiled. "It is to weave the cloth with threads drawn from your own heart, even as if your beloved were to wear that cloth." We have that on our kitchen wall at home. I love that stuff. I guess we're just three incurable romantics here. Luke went to the computer and ran his finger across the touchpad. The password box came up. He typed in the words, Khalil_Gibran. The desktop screen appeared. The wallpaper was a photo of snow-capped mountains, with yellow and green meadows in the foreground. "Looks like we're in business. Thanks, Allie." Luke slipped an external hard drive he had gotten from Swan out of the thigh pocket of his cargo pants. He plugged it into a USB port. The external drive had huge capacities. It could easily swallow this man's entire computer. They would worry later about breaking any encryption. He started the file transfer. On the screen, an empty horizontal bar appeared. On the left-hand side, the bar began to fill up with the color green. 3% green, 4%, 5%. Beneath the bar, a blizzard of file names appeared and disappeared as each one was copied to the destination drive. 8%, 9%. Outside, in the main room, there was a sudden commotion. The front doors banged open. "Police!" someone screamed. "Drop your weapons! On the ground!" They moved through the apartment, knocking things over, blasting through doors. It sounded like there were a lot of them. They would be here any second. "Police! Down! Down! Get down!" Luke glanced at the horizontal bar. It seemed to be stuck on 12%. Nasser stared up at Luke. His eyes were heavily lidded. Tears streamed from them. His lips trembled, his face was red, and his almost naked body had broken out in sweat. He did not look vindicated or triumphant in any way. Chapter 13. 7:05 a.m., Baltimore, Maryland, south of the Fort McHenry Tunnel. Eldrick Thomas woke from a dream. In the dream, he was in a small cabin high in the mountains. The air was clean and cold. He knew he was dreaming because he had never been in a cabin before. There was a stone fireplace with a fire going. The fire was warm, and he held his hands to the flames. In the next room, he could hear his grandmother's voice. She was singing an old church hymn. She had a beautiful voice. He opened his eyes to daylight. He was in a lot of pain. He touched his chest. It was tacky with blood, but the gunshots hadn't killed him. He was sick from radioactivity. He remembered that. He glanced around. He was lying in some mud and was surrounded by thick bushes. To his left was a large body of water, a river or a harbor of some sort. He could hear a highway somewhere close. Ezatullah had chased him here, but that was a long time ago. Ezatullah was probably gone by now. "Come on, man." he croaked. "You gotta move." It would be easy to just stay here, but if he did that, he was going to die. He didn't want to die. He didn't want to be a jihadi anymore. He just wanted to live. Even if he spent the rest of his life in prison, that would be all right. Prison was okay. He had been in prison a lot. It wasn't as bad as people claimed. He tried to stand, but he couldn't feel his legs. They were just gone. He rolled onto his stomach. Pain seared through him like a jolt of electricity. He went away to a dark place. Time passed. After a while, he returned. He was still here. He started to crawl, his hands gripping the dirt and the mud and pulling him along. He dragged himself up a long hill, the hill he had fallen down last night, the hill that had probably saved his life. He was crying from the pain, but he kept going. He didn't give a shit about pain. He was just trying to make it up this hill. A long time passed. He was lying face down in the mud. The bushes were a little less dense here. He looked around. He was above the river now. The hole in the fence was directly in front of him. He crawled toward it. He got caught on the bottom of the fence while pulling himself through. The pain made him scream. 2 old black men were sitting on white buckets not far away. Eldrick saw them with surreal clarity. He had never seen anyone so clearly before. They had fishing rods, tackle boxes, and a big white bucket. They had a big blue cooler on wheels. They had white paper bags and styrofoam breakfast platters from McDonald's. Behind them was an old, rusty Oldsmobile. Their lives were paradise. God, please let me be them. When he screamed, the men rushed over to him. "Don't touch me," he said. "I'm contaminated." Chapter 14. 7:09 a.m. The White House, Washington, D.C. Thomas Hayes, President of the United States, stood in slacks and a dress shirt at the counter in the family kitchen of the White House. He peeled a banana and waited for the coffee to brew. When he was alone, he preferred to quietly come in here and make himself a simple breakfast. He hadn't even put on his tie yet. His feet were bare, and he was tormented with dark thoughts. These people are eating me alive. The thought was an unwelcome intruder in his mind, the kind of thing that occurred to him more and more these days. Once upon a time, he had been the most optimistic person he knew. From his earliest days, he had always been the top performer everywhere he found himself. High school valedictorian, captain of the rowing team, president of the student body, summa cum laude at Yale, summa cum laude at Stanford, Fulbright scholar, president of the Pennsylvania State Senate, governor of Pennsylvania. He had always believed that he could find the right solution to any problem. He had always believed in the power of his leadership. What's more, he had always believed in the inherent goodness of people. Those things were no longer true. 5 years in office had beaten the optimism out of him. He could handle the long hours. He could handle the various departments and the vast bureaucracy. Until recently, he had been on decent terms with the Pentagon. He could live with the Secret Service around him 24 hours a day, intruding on every aspect of his life. He could even handle the media and the lowbrow ways they attacked him. He could live with the way they mocked his country club upbringing and how he was a limousine liberal, supposedly lacking the common touch. The problem wasn't the media. The problem was the House of Representatives. They were immature, they were moronic, they were sadistic. They were a mob of vandals, intent on dismantling him and taking him away one piece at a time. It was as if the House was a student congress at a junior high school, but one where the children had elected the school's worst juvenile delinquents to office. The mainstream Republicans were a rampaging horde of medieval barbarians, and the Tea Partiers were bomb-throwing anarchists. Meanwhile, Closer to home, the House Minority Leader was eyeing his own future run for the Oval Office, and made it no secret that he was willing to throw the current president under the bus. The Blue Dog Democrats were two-faced traitors, glad-handing country cousins one minute, angry white men railing about Arabs and immigrants and inner-city crime the next. Every morning, Thomas Hayes woke secure in the knowledge that his pool of friends and allies was growing smaller by the hour. "You with me, Thomas?" Hayes looked up. David Hallstrom, his chief of staff, stood across from him, fully dressed, looking like he always did, awake, energetic, fully alive, in the battle and eager for more. David was 34 years old, and he had only been in the job 9 months. Give him time. "When did the story come out?" Hayes said. "About 20 minutes ago," David said. "It's already trending on social media, and the TV stations are scrambling to line up guests to debate it on the 8 a.m. shows. It has legs. Between Speaker Ryan and the Iran debacle and terrorists in New York, we are in a bad place right now." Hayes made a fist with his right hand. He had punched exactly 2 people in his entire life. Both had happened long ago when he was a kid in school. At this moment, he would like to make Representative Bill Ryan number 3. "We were scheduled to have lunch tomorrow," he said. "I thought that might be a step forward. Not that we would iron out everything in one meeting, but—" David waved that idea away. "He caught us flat-footed. You have to admit it was a pretty savvy move. He basically calls for your impeachment because you won't start World War III. And he does it with a friendly reporter in an outlet like Newsmax, where there will be no critical commentary opposing it, no balance in the article itself. The whole thing can get tweeted and blogged by the conservative echo chamber all day, and he doesn't have to say another word. It's already taking on a life of its own. Meanwhile, we have to act like adults. We have to hold a press conference to address the threat of a terror attack and the possibility it was sponsored by Iran. We have to answer questions about whether there's a groundswell of support for your impeachment and what we're doing to safeguard radioactive materials across the country." "What are we doing? About radioactive materials?" "Yes." David shrugged. "Well, that depends on what you mean. The policy is that radioactive waste is stored securely, but it isn't always true. Okay, the vast majority of it gets dealt with reasonably well. There are places, like Center Medical Center, by the way, that are pretty good about handling it and removing it to secure sites. But even they ship the stuff in containment trucks, without security personnel, using public roads. Then there are the hospitals that store the radioactive stuff with the biohazard material. There are even a handful of hospitals, especially in the South, that appear to just throw it all out with the regular garbage. I'm not kidding. And don't get me started on the nukes. Originally, all spent nuclear fuel rods were supposed to be transferred to secure storage facilities. But it never happened. The facilities were never developed. The vast majority of spent fuel rods in the United States going back to the early 1970s are stored on-site at the reactors where they were used. And there's evidence to suggest that almost 90% of the reactors in the country are leaking, some of them into the neighboring groundwater. President Hayes stared at his chief of staff. "Why don't I know about these things?" "Well, technically you do know about them. You've been briefed. But it's never been a high priority before now." "When was I briefed?" "You want me to get you the dates?" "I want dates, personnel, content of the briefings, yes." David's shoulders dropped. He paused. "Thomas, I can do that for you. Then what? Are you going to reread a Nuclear Regulatory Commission briefing from 3 years ago? I think we've got bigger fish to fry right now. We've got an ongoing crisis in the Middle East and a drumbeat for war in the media and in the halls of Congress. We've got stolen radioactive material and a potential terrorist attack unfolding in New York City. We're losing the right flank in our own party. They may well go over to the other side en masse by this afternoon. And the second most powerful man in Washington just called for your impeachment. We are standing on an island and the water is rising all around us. We need to take action and we need to do it today." Hayes had never felt so lost. It was all too much. His wife and daughters were on vacation in Hawaii. Good for them. He wished he was there instead of here. He reached for David Hallstrom like the man was a life preserver tossed to him in a stormy sea. What do we do? We circle the wagons, David said. Your cabinet is still firm. They have your back. I took the liberty of calling a meeting for later this morning. We're going to get all the big brains in here and build a unified front. Kate Holscher at Treasury, Marcus Jones at the State Department. Dave Dellinger at Defense can't be here for obvious reasons, but he's going to call in on the secure line. And Susan Hopkins is flying in from the West Coast as we speak. Susan? Hayes began. He couldn't even get past the name. For more than half a decade, he had done everything in his power to distance himself from his running mate and vice president. The whole situation with Susan, the reality of her, embarrassed him. She had begun life as a fashion model. When she retired from that at age 24, she married a technology billionaire. When her kids reached school age, she launched herself into politics with her husband's money. People loved her because she was beautiful. She had stayed fit and healthy and enthusiastic into early middle age. A woman's magazine had recently photographed her out jogging in bright orange yoga pants and a tank top. She was a decent public speaker. She was unstoppable at ribbon cuttings and cook-offs. Her issues were breast cancer awareness, as if somehow people were not already aware of breast cancer, lifelong exercise, and childhood obesity. Eleanor Roosevelt, she wasn't. David raised a hand. I know. You think Susan is lightweight, but you've never given her a chance. She was a 2-term senator from California, Thomas. She is the first female vice president in the history of the United States. These are not small achievements. She's smart and she's good with people. Most of all, she is on your side. You need all hands on deck right now, and I believe she can help you. What can she possibly do? We're not holding a beauty pageant. David shrugged. Your most recent approval rating was 12%. That was taken 3 days ago before this latest disaster. You could be in single digits by next week. Your nemesis, Bill Ryan, isn't doing too much better. He's at 17%, mostly because he's been unable to ram through a declaration of war. He'll probably get a temporary bump from threatening to impeach you. Okay. People are unhappy with the government. David raised a finger. Mostly true, except for Susan. This Iran thing hasn't touched her. Her overall rating is 62%, and she's rock solid among all women except the religious right. Liberal and independent men adore her. She's the most popular politician in America, and it's possible she can loan you some of that popularity. How? By being here in the White House, working side by side with you on the most pressing issues confronting this country while we photograph it. By making public appearances with you, and quite literally, looking up at you on the podium for leadership, as though you are her hero. Jesus, David, dismiss it at your peril, Thomas. This is where we are. I talked to her on the plane just before I walked in here. She understands what's at stake, and she is ready to do these things. She is also ready to take whatever statements we want to make, then stump them on the talking head shows and out in the countryside. Hayes stroked his chin. I just have to decide if I'm willing to do this. David shook his head. The time for deciding about Susan is long past. We need her, and the truth is, you haven't treated her very well. Frankly, you should be glad she's still willing to speak to you. Chapter 15. 7:12 a.m., Ali Nasser's apartment, Manhattan. Down! Stay down! Luke was face down on the stone floor of Nasser's office. They had taken the gun from his shoulder holster. A cop's shoe was on the back of his neck. The cop was heavy-set, over 200 pounds. His bulk could snap Luke's neck, if that's what the man decided to do. With one hand, Luke held his badge above his head. Federal agents? He shouted, trying to match the volume of the cops. FBI! FBI! Ed screamed beside him. This was the dangerous moment, when good guys tended to shoot other good guys by mistake. Someone snatched Luke's badge away. Rough hands pulled his arms behind his back and cuffed him tight. He felt the cold steel bite into his wrists. He made no attempt at resistance. In other rooms of the apartment, cops were still surging through, screaming and shouting. "Stone, what are you doing?" Luke recognized the voice. He craned his head around to see who it was. Ron Begley of Homeland Security stood over him, surrounded by uniformed cops. He stared down at Luke with an expression probably calculated to convey disgust or maybe pity. Begley wore a long trench coat. With his big gut and his coat, he looked like a TV producer's idea of an alcoholic Irish detective. Standing with him was Three-Piece, the NYPD counterterrorism officer from this morning, the one who didn't like being treated like a servant. It took Luke a moment to remember his name, Meyerson, Kurt Meyerson. In a sense, Luke was glad to see them. The man in the chair has been operating a terrorist cell located here in New York. We have evidence tying him to the group who stole radioactive materials from Center last night. Begley crouched near Luke's head. The man is no longer in the chair. We just cut him loose. I guess you must know that he's a diplomat attached to the Iranian United Nations contingent, right? He's hiding behind diplomatic immunity, Luke said. That's what allows him to... We're on the verge of war with Iran, Stone. That much is true. But starting the war is outside of your job description. Begley paused. The squat seemed to take his breath away, but he stuck with it. Can you even imagine the amount of shit that's about to come down from this? The United States of America is going to have to issue a public apology to Iran. This is because you took it upon yourself to invade a diplomat's home, strip him to his underwear, and subject him to questioning that at first glance appears to meet the international definition of torture. The president is going to choke on his Wheaties when he hears about this. And a rogue agent from a secretive FBI unit no one has ever heard of is going to go around and around in the 24-hour news loop, just in case there was anyone left in the country who thought government spying wasn't out of control. Ron, listen, I'm done listening to you, Stone. What good does it do? You're out of your mind. Right now, I've got people contacting Don Morris. Since he's the only person you seem to listen to, he's going to personally relieve you of your command. At this point, you're way past worrying about job security. That man in the next room is very likely to press charges, and if he does, I think you're going to see some jail time. No one is going to protect you. No one is going to stand up for you. Begley lowered his voice. I'll be honest with you. People are already questioning Don's judgment for bringing you up here. The Special Response Team is Don's pet project, right? The whole thing could get broken up and scattered to the winds faster than I even thought it would. You did me a favor today. Begley rose from his crouch. Get the cuffs off these guys, he said to someone nearby. Then walk them out of here, straight out to the elevator, then down to the street. No pauses, no chit-chatting, no looking right or left. If they give you any trouble at all, shoot them both in the head. Sir? Begley shrugged. That's my little joke. Two men pulled Luke to his feet. He caught a glimpse of Begley and Meyerson leaving the room. The cops uncuffed Luke, then handed him his gun and his badge. Ed Newsom stood just to his left, receiving the same treatment. Luke glanced at the computer, his external hard drive still attached to it. The horizontal bar was almost entirely green. The file transfer was nearly done. Luke caught Ed's attention. Ed's eyebrows arched for a split second. Let's go, a cop said. Out. Ed walked first, Luke following. Ed's broad back filled Luke's field of vision. They took 2 steps out of the room. To the right, Ali Nasser sat in an accent chair. He was back inside his plush white robe, talking on his cell phone. A female cop injected a local anesthetic into his hand and immediately began setting his fingers in temporary splints. Nasser made exaggerated winces from the pain. Suddenly, Ed dropped to the ground. His head hit the floor with a thud. His eyes rolled back, showing the whites. A violent tremor went through his body. His head and arms jerked. Within a few seconds, a trickle of white foam began to flow from his mouth. "Oh, Jesus," Luke said. He kneeled by Ed's side. Begley had turned around. "Get out of there, Stone!" Luke stood and backed away, his hands in the air. The cops moved in. "What's the matter with him?" Begley said. "He has a seizure disorder. He was in a Humvee that took a direct hit in Afghanistan, and he sustained a serious head injury, slight brain damage, altered brain waves. I'm not really sure. You just have to keep his airways clear. It could pass in a few minutes." "You guys have an agent in the field that gets seizures?" "I don't make these decisions, Ron." "Okay, step back. These guys know what they're doing. They'll take care of it." Luke took a step back. Then another. A circle of cops kneeled and stood around Ed. A few seconds passed, and Begley returned to his conversation with Meyerson. Luke floated backwards, slowly, as though he were standing still. He retreated into the office. He darted to the computer, pulled out his hard drive, and dropped it into the thigh pocket of his cargo pants. He picked up a blue pen off the desk. He turned. A cop stood in the doorway. Luke held up the pen. "Almost forgot my pen." The cop gestured out the door. "Come on." In the main room, Ed had stopped foaming at the mouth. He lay on his side, barely moving. His eyes closed and then slowly opened. A couple of cops helped him to a sitting position. He blinked his eyes again. He seemed like a person who did not know where he was. "You okay?" someone said. "You hit your head pretty hard." Ed took a deep breath. He was clearly embarrassed to be vulnerable in front of all these macho cops. "I don't know, man. The stress, the lack of sleep. This only happens when I'm run down." Luke glanced around the room. To his right, Nasser was off the phone. He stood talking to the cop who had splinted his fingers. Luke made a beeline for him. "Stone." Luke held out his left hand to Nasser as though he wanted to shake hands. Nasser, grim-faced, ignored the gesture. Luke reached out, grabbed him by his robe, and pulled him close. They were face to face, close enough to kiss. "I know what you did," Luke said, "and I'm going to take you down. You will be unemployed by this afternoon," Nasser said. "I will see to it." Then the cops were everywhere, separating them. A big burly cop put Luke in a full Nelson and swung him around. "Enough!" Begley shouted. "Get those clowns out of here!" In the elevator down, they were surrounded by cops. It was quiet, everyone watching the numbers descending rapidly. "You okay?" Luke said. Ed shrugged. "I'm tired. I haven't had one of those in a couple of years. They wiped me right out. My whole body is still shaking." On the street, the cops let them go. They walked side by side along the tree-lined street, back to the waiting SUV. Luke didn't speak until they were 50 yards away from the cluster of cops. "A seizure?" he said. "You've never had a seizure in your life." Ed smiled. "Seizures are my standby, but to make it work, you have to sell it." "You sold it all right. When I heard your head hit the ground, even I wasn't sure. I swear I felt it in my feet." "Right. Good thing I have a hard head. And I always keep a couple of foaming pills on me to double it down." "How'd you do?" Luke shrugged. "I got the hard drive. And that last little bit, the confrontation with Nasser, that's an old pickpocket move." He reached into his cargo pants, pulled out a new smartphone in a white plastic case. "I took the man's cell phone out of his robe." Chapter 16. 7:20 a.m., Site R, Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. Gentlemen, the meeting will now come to order. 14 men had gathered in a quiet chamber deep beneath the surface of the earth. The chamber was mostly bare, with a large conference table in the center, a poured concrete floor, and rounded stone walls and ceiling. LED lights were mounted in recessed ceiling fixtures. Oxygenated air was pumped into the room through several small vents. The complete lack of windows gave the room the sense of being the dead end of a cave, which is exactly what it was. A claustrophobic wouldn't last 5 minutes in there. There was no audio or recording equipment in the chamber. An intercom attached to the facility-wide communication system had been removed a decade before. Built into one wall was an old interactive computer projection screen, which at one time would display both a map of the world and a map of the United States. It would be used to plot the location of troop deployments, aircraft, even missile launches. Theoretically, the device still worked, but the theory was untested. No one had turned it on since 1998. The chamber was behind a double-thick steel door at the end of a metal catwalk. The catwalk teetered 3 stories above a dim and cavernous command and control room, operated around the clock by a skeleton crew of military personnel. This was the deepest part of the sprawling facility, first opened in 1953 and hardened to withstand repeated direct hits from Soviet-era nuclear ballistic missiles. 10 of the men sat in padded office chairs around the conference table. The men represented various intelligence organizations and branches of the American military, both traditional and special operations. Against one wall, 4 more men sat in folding chairs. These men represented 4 broad civilian industries, including coal mining, oil and natural gas, banking and finance, and aerospace and defense. The group operated in secrecy, even from itself. No one in the room wore identifying markers of any kind. There were no nameplates, no indications of rank, and no combat ribbons or medals in evidence. Indeed, there were no uniforms. The military men all wore dress shirts and slacks. Although most of the men knew one another to some degree, 2 of the men were strangers and had affiliations that were unclear to the rest of the group. A silver-haired, 4-star general, once a commander in the Army Special Forces, stood at the head of the table. He rubbed an old, long-faded scar on his forehead. "You all know me," he said. "You know my role here, so I'll get right to it. Events have moved forward quickly in the past 24 hours, faster than we could have anticipated. In response to these events, and to ensure continuity in the event of a major attack or disruption, we have updated the evacuation plans for all high-level elected and appointed civilian government personnel. The plans are in effect as of 0600 hours, approximately 1 hour and 20 minutes ago. They will remain in effect until further notice. Please pay attention because they are a departure from previous plans." He glanced at a single sheet of paper in front of him on the desk. During an attack or disruption, President Thomas Hayes and Vice President Susan Hopkins will be evacuated by helicopter to the secure Mount Weather civilian government facility near Bluemont, Virginia. In the event of the death of President Hayes, Vice President Hopkins is number 2 in the line of succession and will take the oath of office at Mount Weather. Civilian cabinet members, including the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Education, will be evacuated to Mount Weather, either by helicopter or military convoy, depending on circumstances and availability of aircraft. These individuals represent numbers 5, 6, and 8 in the line of succession, respectively. He glanced at his notes again. In an attack, the Speaker of the House of Representatives will be evacuated by helicopter to this facility, Site R. The Speaker is currently William Ryan of North Carolina. In the event of the deaths of both the President and Vice President, Speaker Ryan is number 3 in the line of succession and will be administered the oath of office here as our guest." He looked around the room, meeting each set of eyes in turn. "In the case of an attack or disruption, the Senate President pro tem will board the Airborne Communications Command aircraft, codename Night Watch, at Joint Base Andrews. The aircraft will remain at a cruising altitude of 40,000 feet, with an escort of fighter jets for the duration of the crisis. In the unlikely event of the deaths of the President, the Vice President, and Speaker of the House, the Senate President is number 4 in the line of succession and will take the oath of office aboard the airplane. The Senate President pro tem is Senator Edward Graves of Kansas, current chairman of the Congressional Armed Forces Committee." A hand at the table was raised. The general recognized a man much older than himself, a former Navy admiral, a man so ancient that once upon a time he led a Marine Corps unit through the shitstorm at Pusan Reservoir during the start of the Korean War. There was an iconic photograph from the event, which had never been declassified, but which the general had seen. It showed the admiral, at 19 years of age, shirtless in a muddy trench, his eyes wild, his face and upper body painted dark red with the blood of dead communists. "Yes?" "You haven't mentioned the Secretary of Defense. Normally he would board the Airborne Command." The general shrugged. "The Secretary of Defense will come here." "Do you anticipate that will cause any problems?" The general picked up the paper in front of him and began to carefully shred it into long, narrow strips. "We don't anticipate," he said, "any problems at all." Chapter 17. 7:40 a.m., Joint Counterterrorism Command Center, Midtown Manhattan. How the hell did Begley know where we were? Luke stood in the doorway of the small room SRT controlled at the command center. Trudy and Swan were there, along with a few guys from the New York office. They stared at him with big doe eyes. Someone in the room was playing innocent. That, more than anything, made Luke see red. "What?" Trudy said. "Begley. He turned up at the Iranian's apartment with the police. Nobody called him. He just showed up. How did he do that?" Swan shook his head. He gestured at his machines. "The stuff is encrypted. I'm on my own network. There's no way Begley's people could break the code in the short time we've been here." "Trudy?" She put her hands in the air, as if he had pulled a gun. "No way, Luke. Don't even go there. I despise Begley. You think I'm going to rat you out to him?" Ed slipped by him and into the room. "I think you want to stay focused, man. No sense chasing rabbits into holes in the ground. I don't believe anybody here sold you down the river." Luke nodded. Ed had a point. "All right." He walked over to Swan and placed the contents of his pockets on Swan's table. I copied the hard drive from his computer. This is his cell phone. I need you to pull the data from it, then destroy the phone and make it disappear. Do that first." Swan shrugged. "They'll know anyway. It's an iPhone. They'll trace its location right to us. They probably already have." "That's fine," Luke said. "But let's not be holding it in our hands when they come looking for it, okay?" "Okay, Luke." Luke glanced at the doorway, half expecting to find Begley standing there. "What have you found in the bank account?" "A lot. Ali Nasser is a busy man. There are a ton of transactions going on with that account. Money comes in, money goes out. Geneva, Nassau, Tehran, Paris, Washington. A lot of it's anonymous, impossible to trace. Well, not impossible, but it would take more time than we have." "Anything interesting that we can see?" "There's this. Over the past 6 months, Nasser has paid more than $8 million to something called the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, which is a company owned and operated by the Chinese government. They build military-grade robotic drones, pretty high-end stuff. The drones can carry air-to-surface missiles and bomb payloads, do surveillance, satellite data links, you name it. And China sells them dirt cheap to people who probably shouldn't have them. North Korea comes to mind. African dictators, non-state actors. Their CH-3A drone is similar in mission capability to our MQ-9 Reaper, but has a price tag under $1 million. You see the picture? Luke saw. Could you put a dirty bomb on board one of those things and say, crash it into something? Swan pursed his lips. Maybe, but keep in mind it would be hard to fly a large payload drone in an area like Manhattan with so many tall buildings around. These aren't backyard hobbyist drones, they're big. We're talking about 8 to 10 meter wingspans, depending on the aircraft. These drones need room to maneuver. They take off, fly, and land like airplanes. They have 3-mile ceilings, but if you flew one that high, air traffic control would pick it up on radar in a minute. Luke tapped the hard drive with Nasser's computer files on it. See if he's got anything on it in here. Before or after I do the phone. Phone first, but move quickly. Swan sighed. No one at this job has ever told me to move slowly. Relax, Swan. Take your time and do a thorough job. Those are words I never hear. If you want to hear those magic words, I think you better go work in the private sector. Swan made a face. What? And make 5 times the salary? I won't hear of it. Luke, Trudy said. He turned to her. Her eyes were wide. She held a cell phone out to him. It's Don, she said. For you.